Well, I'm really happy to be back. Um, this is my third time here to the South Bay Krishna Lounge. And it's always just wonderful. Thought I would talk a little bit. I would start with the second verse in the 9th chapter of Bhagavad Gita, which tells us a little bit about Bhakti Yoga. The chapter is called Most Confidential Knowledge. It's a really interesting chapter. Krishna starts out by saying, I'm going to give you some very confidential knowledge, and he builds through the chapter and kind of progressively glorifies bhakti until he gets toward the end when he says that if someone's sincerely engaged in bhakti, if they're engaged in, if their heart belongs to me alone, even if they really mess up, he says, if they sudurachar, achara means activity, behavior. Durachar, do means do or dur, depending on how it's put together with the rest of the word, means bad. If anybody's ever read Mahabharata, you'll know that many of Dhritarashtra's sons' names start with du. I don't remember what they all meant. I had a list back when I was a Gurukula teacher. I would read Mahabharata to my boys as they were going to sleep. And as we got through, I made a list of all the bad names among Dhritarashtra's. They had 100 sons, and I don't remember, maybe a dozen or a couple of dozen a dozen of them had names with starting with du, like Duryodhana, Dushasana. And su is an intensifier in this context, so it means really bad. So if they're one-pointedly engaged in bhakti to me, even if because of bad habits or bad association or something, even if they do something really awful by mistake, still that person is to be considered saintly. And one of our acharyas, sometimes in his commentaries on the verses in the different bhakti texts, he'll set up a little dialogue where he posits a doubt, and then the doubt is resolved. And so he has Krishna in his commentary, as Krishna saying, so you might wonder. Oh no! So he posits the doubt first. Why should we consider such a person saintly? If he can't behave well. And essentially Krishna says, because I consider him saintly. Because he's really all about me. And that this is one thing that distinguishes Bhakti Yoga from all the other paths that are given in the Vedic literature. And that is that you don't have to do it perfectly. It's okay, Bhakti is so powerful that there's room for mistakes. There's a verse from some Vedic text called Matara Shruti, and the only place I ever find this is in Jiva Goswami's Priti Sandarbha. Jiva Goswami was one of Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's students. Lord Chaitanya taught the teaching of Bhakti Yoga, led by the chanting of the holy names of the Lord, a little over 500 years ago in India. And Jiva Goswami was one of his disciples, one of his students. And he was a powerful philosopher and an amazing writer. So he wrote these 6 treatises explaining bhakti according to Srimad Bhagavatam, mostly according to Srimad Bhagavatam, in 6 books. And the last one, which addresses the goal, the ultimate goal of Bhakti Yoga, which is prema, or love for Krishna, So he cites this verse in this text, and every time I try to remember the whole thing in Sanskrit, I end up missing the third pada. So I'm just going to share the translation. He says, only Bhakti has the power to bring us close to Krishna. Only Bhakti has the power to show us Krishna. Only Bhakti has the power to subdue Krishna. Therefore, Bhakti is the most powerful thing of all. And Bhakti is personified, if you know something about Krishna consciousness, Bhakti is personified by the personification of love for Krishna, who is Srimati Radharani. And if we read the texts, we find that she has the power to cow Krishna, to bring Krishna to tears. If she gets in a little snit and gets a little huffy and gives him the cold shoulder, he goes to his friend, tears streaming down his cheeks, goes to his friend Subal. She doesn't like me. Subal will console him. It's going to be okay. You just, you need to watch yourself. So this is a very, very powerful process. The Bhagavatam we see, someday I'm going to have to count them up. It'd be a good idea to have a count. Some people like that, like statistics. But in the Srimad Bhagavatam, in so many places, probably a couple of places in every canto, we are assured that even though you have to do all the other practices given in the Vedic scriptures perfectly to get the results, Bhakti isn't like that. You don't have to do it perfectly, especially right off the bat. So in order to attain the results of practicing the Varnashram system, social system, which is the kind of the essence of karma yoga, you don't get those results if you don't do it perfectly. And if you engage in the process of what Srila Prabhupada, my spiritual master, sometimes calls speculative knowledge or jnana, which is a process for attaining a kind of liberation, you have to do it perfectly. And you have to be celibate. Same thing with yoga. This is something you won't find in your 24-hour fitness yoga class. That if you actually want to attain the actual results of yoga, which is realization of the Lord as he dwells in the heart of every living being, you have to do it perfectly, and that includes, if you look at Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, that includes celibacy. So the Lululemons make that a little difficult sometimes. That's probably an old joke now. I don't know if people still wear that. But Bhakti's not like that. We see throughout there's a verse I like in the 5th chapter of the 1st canto of the Bhagavatam, where Srila Vyasadeva, who's compiled all the Vedic literatures, is feeling in the dumps. He's dejected, he's depressed, because he feels unfulfilled. After having put together all the Vedas and the Mahabharata and the Ramayana and all this stuff, all for the upliftment of humankind, and he still feels unfulfilled, and he can't figure out why. So his guru, Narada Muni, comes and straightens him out. And he tells him, squares him right away. He tells him, all this stuff, all this work you've done for the upliftment of mankind, compared to what you need to do, compared to what's missing, compared to what's bothering you, is, anybody know the word that he uses? Jugupsitam. I love this part. Jugupsitam. It's disgusting, detestable. In other words, it falls a little short of the mark. And he says, any literature that doesn't directly bring us to bhakti by hearing and chanting the glories of the Lord, it's like a place of pilgrimage for the crows. And where do crows like to hang out? Nasty places like the dump. And, they're carrion birds. When I lived before I accepted sannyas, almost 11 years ago now. I lived sometimes with my former wife in Florida, and a lot of roadkill. When you get out of town, there's a lot of roadkill, armadillos and other things, kind of turtles squished on the road. And you see the crows there working at them. You know, as you approach, they fly away and then right back. Nasty stuff. You know, he tells him that even if you do karma yoga, jnana yoga, ashtanga yoga, even if you do these things perfectly and actually attain the result, guess what? The result's temporary. It wears out. So there's no real gain, he says. But if you engage in bhakti, even imperfectly, you will get the result. Bhakti is that powerful. So here, this is the beginning of the 9th chapter. Krishna says, Raja Vidya Rajaguhyam Pavitram Idamuttamam Pratyaksavagamam Dharmyam Susukam Kartam Avyayam. This knowledge is the king, the knowledge of bhakti, is the king of education, the most secret of all secrets. It is the purest knowledge because it gives direct, and because it gives, I always miss this and by the way my page is laid out here. It is the purest knowledge, and because it gives direct perception of the self by realization, it is the perfection of religion. It is everlasting, and it is joyfully performed. I mean, we had people dancing. This is it. This is Bhakti Yoga. Prabhupada used to tell us over and over again. Simply singing, dancing, feasting, that's our whole process, he would say. Now, there's other stuff to kind of refine a lot of that. And all those things are aimed really at purifying our hearts. So in this verse, Srila Prabhupada points out in his very long purport, one of the things he points out is, you know, he says, the verse says, that this is beyond, the point he makes is this is beyond what we would consider transcendental knowledge. Transcendental knowledge, it means knowledge of the difference between the soul, the self, and the body. But he says this is even beyond that. He says, this is such a confidential part of knowledge. He says, actually, it's a confidential part of knowledge to understand the difference between the body and the soul. He says, but that gives no positive information about the soul. If we look in the 2nd chapter of the Gita, Krishna tells us what kind of tells Arjuna what the soul is largely by telling him what it's not. Can't be cut, can't be withered by the wind, can't be burned by fire, can't be washed away by water, or anything. So, and this is this is one of the strategies you use in definition. Sometimes you define things by what they are, but also by what they're not. And we see in Sanskrit a lot of the definitions in the scriptures, in the transcendental literatures, are, they include 2 parts. The Sanskrit term is tatastha lakshana and swarupa lakshana. So tatastha lakshana, tatastha means marginal. Tatastha is like it's a way of describing the jiva, the atma, ourselves as well. That tatastha is like that littoral zone on the beach, that sometimes, depending on the tide, sometimes it's covered by water and sometimes it's exposed to the air. It's where the kids go build their sand castles, and then the sand castles get washed away, like all of our deeds in this world, like the great empires we built. One of my favorite poems for talking about spiritual knowledge is Percy Bysshe Shelley's Ozymandias, where he describes, there's a whole story behind that, but I'm already out of time, so I won't do it, but and I'm not going to take time to look for the poem. It's a sonnet that was written for the occasion of some relics from the tomb of King Ramses II of Egypt, who intended to build an empire that would last 5,000 years or something. And So he tells this. The poem tells of a wanderer in a far-off land in these desert sands, and he comes across some broken pieces of a big statue. There's the face, there's the foot, there's some stuff lying around, and and there's this kind of like scowl on the face of the on the face of the statue, and on the base of the statue it says, "My name is Ozymandias," is a Greek name for Ramses II. "My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye fallen, and be amazed," or something like that. I don't remember exactly what the last words are. In other words, this guy was building this big empire, and it ended up just like a sandcastle. There's some evidence that something happened here. But this vast empire built by this fellow is just completely, pretty much obliterated. It's all buried under the desert sands. So when we have positive information about the soul, then we understand that there's one of the Sandarbhas by Jiva Goswami is called the Paramatma Sandarbha, and it defines the super soul, tells all the characteristics of the super soul. It tells about the material energy as well. And it also tells about us, that we call it marginal energy. Sometimes, which means we're very much influenced by our environment. But that's what that really means. So this is why we try to create occasions for getting together, for singing and hearing about this spiritual knowledge. And so Bhakti Yoga is a very, how much? Oh, I have 3 minutes. So Bhakti Yoga it's a very powerful, and Srila Prabhupada says in a couple of places in his commentaries in the Gita, very congenial, which is a nice way of, kind of fancy way of saying user-friendly, as we would say nowadays. And in order to feel some effects, we don't have to sit in a cave in the mountains, or on a tiger skin in the forest, naked, in the cold, in the winter, or plunge ourselves in the Ganges River up to our necks in the middle of the winter, way up in the Himalaya foothills or something. We don't have to do that. And we don't necessarily have to be monks or celibate or anything like that. I was married for 40 years. I have 2 daughters. And somehow or other, my wife and I still managed to make some spiritual progress over those 40 years. And it's very, very user-friendly. Just as Krishna tells us at the end of this, a little toward the end of this chapter, he says that even if we offer him with love, with bhakti, something as simple as a leaf, a flower, piece of fruit, or even some water, he says, I accept that. Because what he's really accepting is whatever love we have. One of our teachers in the past, Vrindavan Das Thakur, in his book Sri Chaitanya Bhagavat, talking about the life of Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, he says that Krishna is Bhavagrahi Janardana. Janardana is a name for Krishna. Bhavagrahi means he's looking for the feeling. It's really all about how sincere we are in making that offering, how much bhakti is really there. And the example he gives is someone who's not very well educated might, when he's making an offering, he might say Om Vishnaya Namaha. So he does something grammatically wrong, a declension or something like that. And it's a declension, it's a noun declension. So he does the noun wrong, the object in the sentence. Om Vishnaya Namaha, when it's supposed to be Om Vishnave Namaha. But you know what? If there's bhakti, if he's got some bhava, some feeling for Krishna, that's what Krishna hears. Krishna hears Om Vishnave Namaha. Srila Prabhupada, our guru, once overheard the devotees singing our Gurvashtakam prayers when he was in Los Angeles back in the early 70s, I guess. And he heard the devotees mispronouncing the last line of every verse, 8 verses. Vande Goro Shri Charanaravinda or something, the Prabhupada says. That sounds more like a cow. He says, but because you're sincere, Krishna hears what you mean. He hears what you intend. So he tells us in that verse, 26th verse of the 9th chapter, that if we make an offering with real feeling, even if it's very simple, and even if we do it wrong, he'll accept it to the extent, he accepts, because what he's looking for is the love. He's not looking for, our sapote or our papaya or apple or whatever. He's looking for our love. What do you give the guy who has everything? Because everything comes from him. The one thing he doesn't have, our hearts. So that's the greatest gift we can give anybody, is actually to give them our hearts, give them our love. We make ourselves vulnerable like that. That's why we call it surrender. And then in the next verse he says, in fact, he says, everything you do should be done as an offering to me. And then in the very last verse of the chapter, he says, Manmana bhava madbhakto madhyaji mam namaskar. He says, just think of me. Always think of me. Manmana bhava madbhakto. Become my devotee. Whatever obeisance you have, whatever fealty you have to offer, give that to me. And what he's basically saying is, just love me. And you'll come to me. And I was thinking, coming to Krishna is actually an adventure. I came across an old Facebook thing that I posted it's like one of those anniversary Facebook memory. But it was a picture of Krishna playing with his buddies in the forest. And it was a quotation from Jiva Goswami's Gopala Champu, very beginning of Gopala Champu. One of the things he says is that Goloka, which is Krishna's home in the spiritual world, he says Goloka is Vaikuntha with forests, and it's got cow sheds made out of chintamani or touchstone. I mean, I've seen cow sheds, but I haven't seen any made out of any valuable gems or anything like that, much less something that makes everything that touches it a valuable gem. So, and every day is an adventure. If you read the Krishna book or the early chapters of the 10th canto of the Bhagavatam, you see just every day is an adventure. Krishna goes out with his buddies to herd first the calves when they're little, and then when they get to be a little bigger, the cows. And they get to go farther away and have even cooler adventures. And then they come back and brag about it. And the parents just they roll their eyes like, oh God, here we go. Boys and their stories, And then in the morning when they go out, Mother Yashoda pulls Krishna's big brother Balaram. The absolute truth doesn't have a brother, he has a big brother. There's a story behind that too. And she'll pull him aside and say, you keep an eye on your little brother now. I don't want to hear any of these stories when you get back in the afternoon. You keep him out of trouble. And then they go off, they have their adventure, and they come back and they have their tall tales to tell. So Krishna says just essentially what he says at the end of the chapter. This most confidential knowledge that he's building to, boom, building. And then he says, really it all boils down to just love me. That's all. And you can be with me. This is my promise. And this instruction of just how user-friendly Bhakti is so important. This is right in the middle of the Gita. This instruction is so important that Krishna says it again at the end, right at the end. And he builds to that over a few verses. It's like, okay, watch out. I've given you some very confidential knowledge so far. Now I am going to give you the most secret of all secrets. So buckle up. Manmana bhava madbhakto madhyaji mam. Very user-friendly. Rupa Goswami tells us in his Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, which is an explanation of the science of Bhakti Yoga, he says, every human being is eligible for Bhakti. Doesn't matter where you live, doesn't matter what your religion is, doesn't matter what your race is, doesn't matter what your politics are. You know, I've got devotee friends who are like super left-wing communists, and I've got other friends who are like MAGA Republicans. And when it's time for kirtan, that stuff's all gone. Actually, there shouldn't be room around the temple for that discussion of those things at all, because it creates friction. But when it's time for kirtan, that's all gone. It's all about giving our hearts to Krishna. So that's the gift that we've been given by Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu and his followers, most prominently our spiritual master, His Divine Grace, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. And this kirtan is so powerful that, well, go back 54 years, just a little over 54 years ago, at a Jimi Hendrix concert at the Waikiki Shell in Honolulu, there were thousands of people chanting Hare Krishna at the end of that concert on a full moon night. The moon had just risen from behind Diamond Head, full moon in the spring in Honolulu. And Kapilani Park is a very beautiful setting, very beautiful park, lots of really cool trees. Thousands of people chanting Hare Krishna and dancing at the end of this Jimi Hendrix concert. And two of them at least that I know of couldn't shake it. They were done that night. That was me and Kusha Devi, who I mentioned before, who's our temple president in Honolulu now. We've known each other for going on 54. We didn't know each other. We met the devotees and chanted with them on the same night. And we coincidentally moved into the temple on the same day a few months later, just before Gaur Purnima, so it was March of 1970 that we moved in. We've been friends ever since then. So very user-friendly, even somebody like me, I'm really, if you get down to it, I'm just a kind of insecure kid from Lompoc, California. And, but, this is so powerful that it can even take someone like me, literally pull me out of the ocean. Because I spent as much time as I could surfing at that time, just after I got out of the Navy. I thought, okay, after 3 years in the Navy, I'm going to chill for a while. And, but this chanting is so powerful that that even I'm still doing it, still working on it so many years later. And so that's my hope for all of us, that there will be a strong enough impression from attending these programs that 50 years from now, y'all will still be chanting and dancing. I don't dance so much right now because I let myself get a little bit out of shape. And when you get close to 30, it's a little harder to get back into shape. That joke's gotten real stale too. But the chanting hasn't gotten stale. It just gets better every day. So that's my hope for all of us. Any quick questions or comments? Yes, sir.
Maharaj, when you were saying that Krishna is empowering Janardana, it reminded me of that pastime where the devotee offered bananas to Krishna.
Oh.
Instead of offering the bananas, she offered the beans, but Krishna accepted it.
Yes. That's actually kind of a big story. Krishna had been invited by Duryodhana to a big feast at his palace. It was Duryodhana, he was a prince after all, from a great family, the greatest family in the world. And he invited Krishna to a big feast at his palace. Krishna preferred to go to his devotee Vidura's home, which was more humble. But Vidura was still a statesman. He was advisor to the king. But he didn't have the high social status and the wealth that they had, that some of the others had. And so he preferred to go have dinner with Vidura and his wife. And his wife was so excited that Krishna was in their house that she didn't have a lot to offer him. So she decided, okay, we'll offer him a banana. Now, we know bananas are nothing to sniff at, right? They're pretty good. And of course, the bananas you get at the store, those Bluefield kind bananas, those are the lowest of bananas. We get those bananas because they have a thick skin and they can withstand a couple weeks of shipping and sitting in the store and all that kind of stuff. But where I live in Hawaii, I lived on the Big Island. Almost everybody grew plenty of bananas in their yards. Very easy to grow, and I don't remember anybody who grew those kinds of bananas. They're all different kinds of bananas with a lot more flavor than those. So she's offering him a banana, and it's a real simple. And she's so nervous that she gives him the peel instead. So this is evidence that even if you do it wrong, Krishna will accept it. And Krishna accepted that peel with great delight because it was offered to him with love. That love got her a little discombobulated, a little confused. I feel a little like that, not in a spiritual way, whenever I fly. People ask me, how's the trip? And the worst part for me is in the airport. When you're checking in, you're checking in, you're going through TSA, and you're juggling your phone, your boarding pass, your passport, your wallet, and I have to always remind myself, breathe slowly and deeply, and do everything very deliberately. Otherwise, my wallet will end up in the Doha airport or something like that forever, in the lost and found or something like that. But she was excited. She was all discombobulated because Krishna had come to dinner at their house, and it was her love that moved Krishna to accept that banana peel so readily. Thank you so much. Thank you. Any other questions or discussion? Yes.
Is there a way to assess our bhakti? Because, sometimes as aspiring devotees, we can, wake up early, chant our rounds, read, because, we hear often that these things we need to do in order to develop bhakti. But maybe we do them out of dharma, out of duty. And so how can we transform that duty to love? Because sometimes it could be if you compare yourself, and I know we shouldn't do this, but with other devotees, you see sometimes, they have so much love for Krishna, and then you can feel I don't have I have no love. So when is this love gonna come? And so how can we know if we're getting there? Is there a way?
That there's a nice verse in the 11th canto of the Bhagavatam. It's a very dangerous question. It's like a whole another class for me. And I used to think of this verse as kind of the barometer. Oh, here we go. No, that's still okay. I'm still much more adept at navigating analog books than I am digital books. I just have a hard. This is a really interesting verse, and Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur uses this verse as evidence when he's talking about that verse. I was from the first canto that I was mentioning. He said, there are two verses that work together there, the 17th and 19th verse in chapter 5. In the 17th verse, he says, even if you engage in jnana, yoga, karma, you do all those things perfectly, still the results are temporary, so there's no real gain. But that danger's not there when you're engaged in bhakti. And he says, even if someone falls away from their practice, and Vishwanath Chakravarti explains, he says because of poor determination, Srila Prabhupada says because of bad association, still nothing's lost. Because whatever you gain is permanent, just like Krishna says in this verse, it's everlasting, it's eternal, and it's joyfully performed. nothing's really lost, just as Krishna says that. Krishna says the same thing in the second chapter of the Bhagavad Gita. So this verse, Bhakti Pareshana Pavo Viraktiranyatra Chaisha Trieka Kalaha, oops, I went the wrong way. Prapadyamanasya Yashnatas Yus Tushti Pushti Kshudapaya Nukhasa. So he says, the verse, this is a sage speaking to King Nimi, and he says, three things happen simultaneously as we engage in devotional practice. Bhakti, Pareshano Bhavo, and Viraktiranyatra. So bhakti means a sense of devotion. That's there in the activity itself. Pareshano Bhava means having some direct experience of the Lord. And that can be something as simple as getting so much into the kirtan that you're flying around the room, like a couple of us were a little while ago. And the third is anyatracha, detachment from everything else. And he compares it to eating a meal. Because he says three things happen simultaneously and progressively. I forgot that part. Simultaneously and progressively as we eat a meal, three things happen at the same time. Tushti, pushti, kshudapaya. So pleasure, relief from hunger. Pleasure, nourishment, and relief from hunger. And they're analogous, right? There's the pleasure of engaging in bhakti. There's the nourishment that comes, the encouragement that comes from having some direct experience of the Lord. And the result is, just like breakfast this morning. I just thought at the end of breakfast, somebody brought me I got one of Kanai Balai's burritos, they're pretty big. And a pile of avocado. And then, must have had something else. I had fruit. And then I tried out Vaishnava's peanut butter halava. And somebody said it's particularly good with kheer. So I had a thing of kheer. And
I didn't say that.
He said it.
No, that was...
Gira,
Yeah, it was Giridhari Priya. He says, especially good with the kheer. Because peanut butter sandwiches and cold glass of milk, right? Love and marriage, right? So at the end of breakfast, I had one of those feelings which I've had, I don't know how many thousands of times over the last 50 years. I've never used it. I don't think So and Vishwanath Chakravarti explains, so these two things are analogous, but then he points out the flaw in the analogy. And there's almost always a flaw in our analogies, right? They're not perfect, but they give us the idea. He says the flaw in this analogy is that you can't keep on eating forever, but you can keep on serving the Lord forever. So that'll continue that sense of bhakti, that experience of the Lord, and detachment from everything else. Those things, they just grow and grow forever. So if we watch and see the extent to which we feel more bhakti for the Lord, the extent to which we experience the Lord in a kirtan, or appreciate the beauty of the deities in the temple, or get some pleasure from reading some pastimes in Srimad Bhagavatam or something like that, and the extent to which we get, we become detached from all material endeavors. That's our measure. And how to get there? We just get up and do it every day. There's one more story. I swear I'll stop. You know they're lying. Politicians are always lying when they say, I swear to God. I swear on my mother's grave. I swear on my children. This is one of my favorite stories about practice. This is an anecdote, maybe somewhat apocryphal. I've seen a couple of versions of it, and I haven't found it 100% nailed down and confirmed, but it's true anyway, because it needs to be